All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unwelcome Access Podcast. As always, I am your host, Ross Edelstein, and let's get into it. This week, I was originally going to have the transit episode out, but something came up that we'll talk about at the end of this episode that led to me wanting to cover employment and then get transit out next week. I am doing the edit of that transcript today along with this one. It will be done. We just have a change in policies that I wanted to get this out so that people could actually do the advocacy on their end. That said, on the screen you have a picture of two CSX locomotives pulling a train over a small bridge in a green park setting. You've got grass in the foreground and trees in the background. We are mostly going to be talking about employment. Now, we're going to give some context on employment versus occupation and work and labor and some of that. But I did want to sort of start with that and start with a story time with Ross. So today I am going to be telling another Taco Bell story. Now on the screen we have me driving a diesel locomotive, sitting looking like I am very angry, but I am actually having the time of my life in this photo. That said, this story is going to be about first getting hired at the first store I worked at. I worked at two different Taco Bells over my time there. One that was where I grew up, and one that was where I went to undergrad. The one where I grew up is sort of how I got my foot in the door, and I was sort of pushed to go there by some friends of mine. That was actually how I got my foot in the door, is knowing somebody, and this is a very common thing. When I did the interview, I was supposedly missed one thing on their sort of pre-employment sort of questionnaire, personality test thing. And later on, after becoming one of the most versatile and sort of good at my job workers there, I asked the general manager who hired me, hey, why was I originally put on just cleaning up the lobby? A position that generally was not given to people who were competent at actually doing the work, which has nothing to do with ability status, such as having a disability or not. There are some people who just don't want to work, and we'll come to that, but in this case, it's people who really did not want to be there and were not actively participating in the job. It was also often given to people who were less capable, often disabled people, as it was a position that was a benefit but not really needed. And the general manager, kind of getting to that point, well, I recognized you were disabled, but I didn't recognize how disabled you were, and I wanted to give you a chance. Instead of, giving me the job that I had said, hey, I would prefer to do something that doesn't involve customer interaction, I was basically given the customer interaction only role of go bring people food, go wipe off the tables, go clean up and restock things for 4 hours a week, 5 days a week, where I could only get there by bus. And a really difficult to navigate bus system at that. But that's next week for transit. That being said, the reality is that is not an uncommon thing to happen to disabled people, where, sure, they're given a chance, but it's barely a chance at all. But let's get more into that. Let's talk about employment and occupation. Now, on the screen, I did try to choose more freight or commuter type pictures for this, and we have another freight locomotive on the screen. It is another CSX locomotive There's one sort of in front of it, hiding behind a tree, with some trees sort of behind it, and a gray freight car that is used for carrying grain on the left side of the photo, sort of up on a hill with some trees and grass in the foreground. Now, when we're talking about this episode, and particularly employment and occupation, I want to make clear that we're using the occupational therapy sense of these things. Namely, and this is vastly simplifying one of the core points of an entire field of study, employment is what do you do to get money? What is the thing you do as a job, as your labor? Occupation is the more broad, how do you spend your time and participate in the world? Which is sort of what occupational therapy is all about, right? It's how do I actually engage with the world around me and participate fully in whatever I want to do. So employment and jobs and work and labor are focused on one section of it, a very important one, especially when we live in a capitalist economy that requires you to work to get money. And in most cases, getting money that is not to the value of the work that you're providing, which we will come back to. But one real important thing is that not everyone needs to be employed to have a full life. There are plenty of people who, if you gave them adequate resources, would be perfectly happy to do things that benefit themselves and others without needing to get a formal job. And I want to talk about that in a moment, but we have lived for so long in the US in particular in a society that puts the thing that you do, your labor, as a core part of your full life. For a lot of disabled people, it's very hard to live in that way for any number of reasons, which we'll get into. But because we do live in that same capitalist space that requires you to work for a living, being employed ends up being how you get money, how you get resources to do the things that you actually want to do. Like, for example, going and seeing trains. I am recording this and re-recording the transit episode after this episode and editing them and getting them ready to go, not because I really want to do these things all back to back, but because I'm going on a work trip that is allowing me to also do things I want to do, see trains with my partner. That being said, let's talk about some of the history behind this. Now, on the screen, this is from, why can't I think of the name? It is part of the Ford Museums. Let me look this up real quick live. But on the screen, you have a water wheel in some various reeds and water plants growing out of the ground, and, well, out of the water rather, and various buildings around it. And I chose this because historic work, well, what better is a water wheel to show that? Greenfield Village. I don't know why I couldn't think of that to save my life there. But Greenfield Village is a living history type of space, really cool. A lot of the photos will be from a trip related to visiting this. They do have a train, which is not going to be featured here. But the first thing I want to talk about is when we're looking at this, a lot of this history is going to look at sort of the difference between acquired disabilities and congenital disabilities. And what that means is, did you get this disability after you were born, or were you born with it? And that is for acquired disabilities and congenital disabilities, respectively. Going to those disability models, the medical and the social model, quick refresher, as always, medical model, disability is something that is wrong with a person and needs to be fixed. generally, I've talked about it in more depth in other places. Social model, yes, somebody is disabled and faces barriers because of that, but most of those barriers come from the choices of others. So in this case, there is a lot of difference, especially over time, with both acquired and congenital disabilities. There is always a little bit more, if you look at the history of it, sympathy for a lot of people who have acquired disabilities, and a lot more support that's provided and understanding that's provided. It's, if you're looking at, say, a medieval peasant, oh, they lost their arm. Poor them, they can live at home and don't have to put as much effort into tilling the fields. The other part is that historically, a lot more of the care was provided in a community sense. So families and the village more broadly were able to share the load of providing care for somebody who couldn't work. So, for example, providing food and resources, even if somebody is otherwise able to do daily tasks, they might not be able to farm. And so, hey, here's a few vegetables from my garden, or here's some of the meat I just slaughtered. Generally, people, for a lot of history, who had very significant support needs did not work. And in particular, if you're looking at intellectual and developmental disabilities, a lot of people who had them really weren't expected to provide in the way we expect people to provide for themselves today. There are exceptions. There's a lot of great stuff out there on things like jesters and fools, and how a lot of folks with intellectual disabilities, or what we would consider now as intellectual disabilities, again, go back to my autism episode to hear my whole rant on historical diagnosis, but a lot of people who are seen today as having intellectual disabilities likely would have been in those positions because they could criticize the king and socially not face repercussions. But even then, that's one or two people. In general, people were not participating in the workforce as we consider it today. And then you have the rise of industrialization and capitalism, sort of Europe and the US. Just after the American Revolution, you start to have people working outside of their home more and more. Things like British mining and factories, or the various textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, and so on. A lot of these various positions started to mean that people were not able to adjust their schedules to care for others. And so you start to get the idea of disabled people really being a burden that ends up informing a lot of the medical model. This leads to the idea of, well, we as society need to provide support in the form of institutions. And so you get various asylums that end up being, well, we'll put all the people who have various disabilities that affect the brain, with the caveat that a lot of these people also just were experiencing things like abuse from their partners or whatever, and were labeled as insane and put in these asylums. And this will be the place where they can live and get the bare minimum to stay alive, and this will be ethical and good for them. It's segregation, more or less. You also get schools for the deaf and schools for the blind, a lot of which still exist today. And for a lot of those, we'll talk more about it with education, they always had this idea that, well, unlike those people at the asylums, these deaf people, these blind people, they can still think and participate if we give them the right support. A lot of the same issues that we had with institutionalization were still present there, where there was a lot of abuse by staff, you were really disconnected from your family and from being able to do what you wanted to do, not a lot of personal choice. And while these institutions in particular were able to become a whole lot better in the post sort of World War II era, for a long time it was very similar of, we'll put them over here so that they aren't a burden to society. And this was true for a lot of disabled people, whether it was congenital or acquired. A lot of war veterans, particularly after, say, the Civil War, ended up not getting a whole lot of support, especially if they had a battlefield injury. But then the Great Depression happens. Now, even during all of this, people who, in particular farmers who had acquired disabilities, were still able to get that community support. But the same with all sorts of other folks. Because again, the Roaring Twenties, the US had plenty of money flowing around, to the point of people not necessarily having issues supporting others. Well, the Great Depression destroyed a lot of that. And so one of the first things to come up was the social safety net of Social Security. And basically one of the things that came with that was the idea of, well, if you're disabled, here is a minimum payment so that you do not die. Because we're going to keep capitalism going, but we're also going to try to provide the bare minimum for people who can't participate. And this gets expanded over the years. That's going to be a whole other episode. But it starts to change the way that we think about things of, well, maybe there are things that aren't just push them over here and hide them that we can do for disabled people. And that's how you get the rehab acts, the rehabilitation acts, which go back and watch my last episode on the disability pride and the various big disability touch points. The rehab acts were not about 504. That was sort of snuck in at the end in a very good way. The rehab acts were mostly providing vocational rehabilitation, which we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But the idea is, well, we can provide resources for programs to help people learn what jobs they can do that they might not otherwise be able to do. 504 also establishes non-discrimination in hiring for federal contractors. And then you get the ADA, sort of a few years later. This is, again, an abbreviated history, but the ADA establishes the idea that employers, period, cannot discriminate against disabled people and sets up the reasonable accommodation process, which I'll talk about in a bit, having gone through it. But the ADA really is a landmark in that it establishes that nobody can do this kind of discrimination. Remember, 504 touched a lot, but only if the federal government did business with you. The federal government didn't do business with you, well, you didn't have 504 protections. That being said, let's talk about sheltered workshops and minimum wage. Now, the photo I have here is of various CTAL rail cars in a yard. In front of the cars, there's a bunch of buffers, and they're sitting on the tracks in a black and white image. I just like this image. It doesn't really have a ton to do with work, although it is a repair yard, so they could be worked on. But one thing that we need to cover that didn't really have a good space for it, but it also needed its own slide, sheltered workshops and sub-minimum wage. Now, the Rehab Acts did a lot of really good things, and we'll talk a little bit about this at the end with the call to action. But one of the things they established was the idea of a sheltered workshop, which is intended to provide skills for disabled people who otherwise would not have a chance to get employed. Remember what I said during the story time about the employer who basically thought, oh, since he's disabled, I'm only going to give him the bare minimum job? A lot of sheltered workshops are intended to sort of do the same thing, where somebody can apply to do it. You are given a position that is sort of a low-rung job to provide skills and teach people to engage in the workplace properly, and then eventually you can graduate from there and get a real job and participate fully. And participation here, I mean in the occupational therapy sense of you are able to do all the things that you are expected to be able to do as a member of society. Now, sheltered workshops and sub-minimum wage go hand in hand. Sub-minimum wage is whatever the federal or state minimum wage is. You are allowed to pay less than that if you meet certain requirements. Generally, if you are participating in a sheltered workshop program employing disabled people, in particular, usually folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities or blind folks. The idea is if we allow people to be paid less than the federal government, the idea is if we allow people to be paid less, they'll be more likely to get hired because that's less burden. Again, we're coming back to that term, on the employer. These straight up do not work. Usually what sheltered workshops end up being, especially nowadays, these are the jobs that nobody else wants to do. A lot of sheltered workshops do things like recycling sorting, which the thing about recycling sorting is it doesn't really have a way to be fully automated yet. And because it can't be automated, you need actual people. But it is gross and tedious work, so people don't really want to do it. It's much easier to do things like actually sorting your recycling, but people are lazy. So we have single sort recycling, where it's just put all your recycling in one thing. We're not going to have somebody come through and sort it. We're going to give it to disabled people who we value less and are paying pennies on the dollar per hour to do this tedious, often in many cases dangerous, especially with people throwing away things like batteries. And usually these jobs also aren't providing a lot of skills, and employers really aren't providing a lot of coaching. There's not a ton of margin for these kinds of jobs that often are related to sheltered workshops. There are exceptions. For example, there is a part of the Rehab Act that requires the federal government to buy a certain amount of office supplies from sheltered workshops for blind folks. Office supplies have a little bit higher of a margin. In general, though, these don't benefit the employee, right? Sure, producing office supplies in a factory setting might have some transferable skills. Sorting recycling, not as much. And in general, you're not providing the actual coaching and skills development that people need. Because again, it's sort of throwing you into the deep end without direct support, which we'll talk about this more in the education episode. Turns out it's much easier to actually support people if you don't have a huge number of people involved in the process, such as one manager and say 30 people working under them that they all have to coach with very particular needs. And this ends up becoming segregation as opposed to a way to promote integration. Basically meaning disabled people are kept away from everybody else in their little disabled people corner doing the shitty job that might hurt them or somebody else, when everybody else gets to have more choice in what they want to do and what aligns with their skills. Supported employment sort of is the more recent development from this model that actually turns out works, which is you have a worker from vocational rehabilitation. They work with an employer who generally will have the wage subsidized, but it's the full wage. But that subsidized wage is in part paid for by the government. And you not only have the job coach, but you only have one or two people at a job site, which allows managers to not necessarily have to put more time into coaching the individual person. This allows them to build actual skills to engage with however they want to work, and which are more transferable to other jobs, even if it's something like retail or fast food. And I can tell you, there are skills that I developed in fast food, in particular during the customer service work, that I still use today. This allows also somebody to not be sort of separated with only people like them. One of the benefits of integration and being a part of your community is that you get to meet other people who aren't like you and learn from them. And integration makes you more of a part of the community. Sheltered workshops don't really provide that support that really getting a job just in the community allows you to have. Being able to be a part of your community basically is one of the big things that disabled people see as a benefit from employment. There are all sorts of things I can say about, well, we shouldn't need to force people to have a job. But if you actually talk to a lot of disabled people, particularly with higher support needs, they actually really feel like they are benefiting from having even a regular minimum wage fast food or retail job. Because as it turns out, they want to feel like they're included. And really, if we want to get rid of the issues with employment, we need to address the whole system so that people don't feel like they have to do a job to have value. That being said, we are going to go ahead and have our mid-roll. Take it away, Ross of the past. Wow, Future Ross, what a great ad. Or maybe there isn't one. As always, our primary sponsor is you, the viewer, over on patreon.com/unwelcomeaccess. However, this space is intentionally left open for disabled people who have a project, a business, something they want to get out there to help platform people who might not otherwise get a chance to share in this sort of format. That said, back to your regular programming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. Thank you, Midroll Ross. Now, on the screen, we have a photo of a Amtrak charger locomotive pulling into the Ann Arbor station. The photo is taken from a mini-high platform, essentially a place to allow level boarding at an otherwise low platform station. And I've titled this section, sort of the rest of this episode, Modern Barriers: A Practical Approach. Here I really wanted to hit a lot of the barriers people face, and any one of these could be its own episode. But this is a good overview as a way to sort of look at these in general. That being said, let's get into it. So the image on the screen is a Metra train on the closer track, moving down the tracks with some smoke coming out of the top, while behind it is a freight train with several tank cars, some gondolas, which are sort of low, flat cars that can carry various things. And it's during a summery day. There's grass sort of next to the side of the train tracks and a fence preventing people from going and walking on the train tracks all willy-nilly. Modern barriers really starts before you even get in the door. As I mentioned, one of the big things that sort of becomes the theory for both supported employment and sheltered workshops, as much as sheltered workshops don't work, is that a lot of disabled people aren't given the chance to get skills. There will be a whole episode on that with education, and probably a whole series, but not having the right skills for a job often means people don't feel welcome. In addition, this comes into it with the hiring process too, but job sites and descriptions often become a barrier themselves, such as being overwhelmed by, oh God, there's so many jobs, how do I find the one that actually fits my needs? I've been looking for a full-time job that isn't just me running around and doing consulting since October of 2024. And this has been a constant thing that will often make me have to stop and then go back to looking at a later date, which is difficult because when you're looking for jobs doing accessibility work or disability work, those are also things that are in the description for other reasons. And so you end up with, say, 1,000 jobs, and only 5 or 6 of them are relevant to my actual skills and ability to apply, or rather, ability to do the job. And then you get the stigma, and it's often the stigma of, oh God, I have been discriminated against before. I'm going to go into this as somebody who is going to struggle, and I'm going to get discriminated against, and I don't fit perfectly, so therefore they're going to find that as an excuse to get rid of me, and if I say I'm disabled, they're going to not hire me and all that type of stuff. We'll come back into this, but this often means that people don't apply unless they are perfectly suited for the role. And even then, you're less likely to get it. And then there's location, location, location. And by this, I mean, you could have a perfect job that exists for you, but moving away from your support network, whether you have high support needs, low support needs, whatever, isn't feasible for you. It could also be that the job's location isn't somewhere you can get to. Like, it could just be you don't have a car and can't drive, and the paratransit service doesn't serve that area, and it would be too expensive to get an Uber. It can also be that the job itself is not one that can be made accessible. One of the things we'll talk about with reasonable accommodations is not every job can do a reasonable accommodation. And not every job has to absolutely not discriminate, because sometimes there are accessibility concerns. Sometimes these are made up. Especially when you look at the blanket bans on, say, getting a pilot's license or being a commercial pilot for certain disabilities. Sometimes they're absolutely valid. Someone who has an active history of seizures probably shouldn't be operating heavy construction equipment. That becomes a case of, well, that limits somebody to what they can actually go for, especially if there is that legitimate safety concern. Because again, the first rule of anything is do it safely. And at the end of the day, finding that balance is often one of the big concerns. That being said, the hiring process provides a lot of issues itself. On the screen, we have the Norfolk Southern Jersey Central Heritage Unit hiding behind some trees on a bridge. And this locomotive is yellow and sort of orange gold yellowish, with that orange and gold in a stripe down the center. The hiring process itself is an issue for a lot of reasons, especially in the more modern sense. Now, I've alluded to some of the application process issues. A lot of the various HR input softwares use AI now. And one of the things that AI has done is basically take the onus of, well, I want to discriminate against this person, but I need to figure out a way to make it look like I'm not discriminating against them for a protected reason. off of the actual hiring manager, because it throws it into a black box and then spits out whatever biases that black box was trained on for AI. And in a lot of cases, this means that because AI, especially large language model generative AIs that were trained on the totality of the internet, a lot of that ends up being, how do I put this? Ableist? Yes, that is how I put it. But it ends up being quite ableist, because when you're drawing from a lot of people, not everybody understands that being ableist isn't okay, especially if you look at things like the use of the R word, especially online. So you could have a perfect application, but you mention you're disabled, or even in some cases, you could mention, I've worked with autistic people in the past, and you get discriminated against. The same happens with race and gender in many cases. And in many cases, it allows managers to not have to do the dirty work. And managers or the larger corporate overlords, because as it turns out, disabled people do sometimes cost a little bit more to actually be a part of it. There's also a lot of busy work in the hiring process. Cover letters and other sort of, I have to do this again. So there is, especially when you're looking at high-level professional jobs, a place for a cover letter. A lot of the jobs I've applied for are not that. And every single one has had the, well, I am doing a just above entry-level job, I have to do yet another cover letter. And then there's the fact that for a lot of resumes, you then have to re-enter your information into the hiring portal. That is the exact same stuff that was in your resume. But you also have to include a resume or you don't get hired. And then there's the fact that, as happened with a recent job I applied for, a lot of positions end up reopening them in many cases. And when that happens, it adds another layer, especially if you weren't rejected in the first go around. You end up either missing that email that says, oh, you have to reapply, or perhaps you just never get the executive function to redo something you've already done, which can be more difficult. And then there becomes the question of disclosure. Do I tell somebody that I'm disabled or not? I generally do, because especially with this podcast out there and all the other work I do, and also the whole I am the CEO of autism thing, I can't hide that I'm autistic, even if I have very low support needs, all things considered, especially for somebody who has the ability to do all that I do. That said, that choice to disclose or not then becomes a toss-up, especially since a lot of applications do ask, are you disabled? Then there are the interviews. So this is another place where bias comes up, because the interviewer has their biases. And in a lot of cases, whether it's the actual manager for the position or a hiring manager or whatever, the biases often can lead to, say, a small flub in how you talk, leading to a mistake, or being perceived as somebody who shouldn't get the job, rather. There's also a lot of interview requirements, such as having to get there in person, especially if, say, you haven't had a job for a while. You might not have the money to fill up your car to go and drive and do an in-person interview, especially if there's a job that you're trying to move somewhere else for. There's also the fact that if you do have a job and are relying on the healthcare, you might not be comfortable saying, hey, I have a job interview, I need to take some time off and run and do that. And that can make it more difficult to switch jobs to something that might provide better for you. And then a lot of working interviews can lead to all of these things that can keep somebody from getting hired in the first place, especially those biases, but their work still becoming a part of whatever company you were working for, which then puts the disabled person at a further disadvantage, because not only do they not have the product that they created, they aren't being compensated for it. But let's say you get through all this and get your job. Now on the screen we have at a metro station a BNSF pair of diesel locomotives pulling a long mixed freight train with various cars behind it, and it's just a decoration photo. But the reality is, once you get on the job, you still have barriers there. So, performance goals. Everybody talks about it, and everybody talks about the fact that these can be misattributed and often used in a way that, well, it gives me a reason to fire somebody I don't like. Combine that with bias that already exists, but also you end up with these performance goals often being based on people who aren't disabled. If, say, it takes me longer to process something even, that might lead to, say, me not meeting that goal, especially if it's one that's been turned into you have to do X number of tasks in Y amount of time. Well, once you have that, we have that bias from others come up again. And in that, you have both conscious bias and unconscious bias. Conscious bias being, oh boy, I'm going to go do an ableism. Oh boy, I don't think any people who are disabled or have a particular disability should work here. Unconscious is all of that media and all of that stuff that you've been fed, leading to you having a less than ideal view of somebody who's disabled as a potential candidate. And oftentimes you don't know it until you take a moment to address those biases. And this happens with your managers, but also with other coworkers. You might not get invited to other company events because of the bias in somebody's mind, even if it is intended to be good. Well, somebody in a wheelchair can't bowl. Not true. So we shouldn't invite them to bowling night. Even if they can't bowl, why can't they participate socially? And that participating socially, especially outside of office hours, might influence other people to have other bias against them because, oh, they don't come and participate, which is a whole other can of worms of requiring people to participate outside of office hours to feel included. That said, that does lead to a lot of discrimination, but nobody realizes that it leads to that and that it comes from disability in many cases. And then you have reasonable accommodations, which is the last part of this sort of overview of various barriers on the job. Reasonable accommodations are a particular legal term found in the ADA, and the whole thing about reasonable accommodations isn't that, say, you have to do exactly what one party or another finds reasonable. It's a negotiation. In most cases, what the disabled person is asking for is reasonable. Say, when I was at my last full-time position, I went through the process to get my remote work protected, and particularly hybrid work, so that I didn't have to go down all the time. In most cases, I didn't need to go down at all. But it was I understand that we need to meet in the middle, and there will be cases when I need to be in the office in person, and there are benefits to it. Not every job needs it, but there are sometimes benefits. And going through that process was basically presenting, this is the accommodation I need, this is the support that says, hey, I have this accommodation, and I need it. Here is what I'm anticipating. Now, once that's given to HR, either HR or whoever is functioning in that role says, okay, this looks good, and sends it along, or in many cases, then says, well, here's what we can provide. And oftentimes, when you're asking for adaptive equipment, that's where that comes into play. But also, in many cases, places do not want to give that reasonable accommodation because they have this idea that, well, then I have to do this for everybody. And also, a lot of employers do not like remote work, as we've been discovering, when the reality is remote work is a reasonable accommodation for most disabled people in many jobs. Now, again, you can't really do that if you're working at a factory. But for a lot of office jobs, it's absolutely a reasonable accommodation to have. But that reasonable accommodation basically has to be reasonable for both parties. And you have to actually have the time to go through that and set it up and have both sides give their why. And if basically the disabled person feels like, no, you're actually not being reasonable with saying no, that's when you then get into employment law, which is a whole other conversation for another day. And I'll probably do more on reasonable accommodations later when it's not a part of the episode, but its own thing. That being said, the resistance there can lead to barriers. And once you ask for it, that puts you out there as disabled, especially if otherwise you wouldn't have a disability that others would see. It then makes your disability more visible when you have that different way of engaging. That being said, I want to get into the what can you do. And for this, I chose a picture of the Chicago skyline with various skyscrapers in the background and some of the lifting bridges that are near the loop in sort of the midground with various train tracks and trees kind of cut off in the foreground. But for what you can do, the listener, there are a number of things. First, if you are an employer, go work with vocational rehab and find ways for somebody to participate. Even if, say, it's something like a museum. Disabled people being able to volunteer and actually get those skills could open them up for other jobs. Ideally, pay people though, if you absolutely can. That being said, the other one that I wanted to hit is, and I will have the link at the top of the description for this, there is a place to comment on proposed Department of Labor regulations. Now, this is not a vote or a petition like get 5 million signatures for end discrimination or whatever. This is a part of the rulemaking process. It is a very small thing that you can do, but the Department of Labor is seeking to change a rule around what is required for people who get money around what is known as, I'm pulling this up so that I have the official name, and I'll have the link to the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network's plain language guide to this, but under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, there is a requirement for particularly vocational rehab agencies that help people out to go out and actually find people who need their services. This is a good thing because in a lot of cases, finding people who need these services gets them into the hands of people who need them the most. This actively would hurt disabled people if it was taken out, and that is what the Department of Labor is going to do. Going and making a comment, and there is information on the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network's website on ways to comment, but the reality is that making these changes will hurt people with disabilities. But that is a relatively low stakes thing that you can do. It can be completely anonymous. but showing that we are caring about this and actively trying to make things better can help, because it turns out the people who are making these rules do not like when they get the slightest iota of pushback. The other thing to do is address your own biases in work. When somebody else is getting a reasonable accommodation, don't go, well, why can't I do that? If you're a manager, actually hire disabled people and also recognize that, hey, maybe that is actually reasonable. Maybe I don't need all my people to be in the office all the time, so on and so forth. But also don't, if somebody can't participate in the non-workplace things, because again, working takes energy, and disabled people, as I said in the disability tax episode, might not be able to participate in the same way that everyone else can at the same level. Be not judging people based on whether or not they came to the Christmas party and avoiding making that what you decide to help somebody with work tasks about is all about looking at yourself. And that is something you can do for free with no real change or no real huge amount of effort needed to go into it in terms of, well, I have to take a whole class or whatever. It requires you actually putting an effort to make those changes against those biases, but it is something you can do yourself. But also work with local advocacy groups. See what the ARC or other groups like that advocate for employment. See what they need right now. That is something that, if you are one for organizing and doing the community action, that's a great place to do it. But that's where I'm going to end it. And I appreciate everyone listening. Again, please go out and actually make those comments. It is time sensitive from when this video comes out, and it's important, and doesn't really require a lot from you. That being said, thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. A huge shout out to the wonderful people over on Patreon who are helping to make this project happen. As always, we aren't getting any ad revenue from YouTube, and we also aren't. You'll also get your name up on the screen right about now, like these lovely people who have helped support the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode. Unwelcome Access is a production of Autism, a disability and accessibility consulting organization.